Sometimes God speaks loudest through the things that break us. In the storm-lashed parish of Our Lady of Sorrows, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds and the Gulf of Mexico crashes endlessly against weathered seawalls, Father Miguel Santos had stopped believing in miracles years ago. The September hurricane that tore through San Esperanza, Louisiana, seemed determined to finish what time and neglect had started on his crumbling church, until that steel beam came screaming down through the sanctuary roof like the wrath of heaven itself. Miguel should have died protecting that statue. Every doctor at Sacred Heart Hospital confirmed it. His spine had been crushed, his ribs shattered like kindling. But 3 days later, when he walked out of that hospital room on legs that should never have moved again, the real mystery wasn't his healing. It was what had awakened inside him. Now people traveled thousands of miles to touch his hands, claiming he could cure cancer, mend broken bones, restore sight to the blind. And the Virgin Mary statue? It weeps tears of blood that locals swear perform miracles of their own. But Miguel knows the truth is darker than divine intervention. The statue whispers to him in languages that predate Christ, revealing family secrets that stretch back centuries. Was he truly chosen by God, or has something far older claimed him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The morning Father Miguel Santos discovered his hands could heal, he was trying to fix a broken coffee maker in the rectory kitchen. 6 weeks had passed since the hurricane, since the impossible walk from his hospital bed, since the reporters and pilgrims began their relentless siege of San Esperanza. The media circus had finally moved on to fresher miracles, leaving behind only the truly desperate, the ones who hitchhiked from Oklahoma with dying children, who mortgaged their homes for gas money to reach this forgotten corner of Louisiana. Miguel pressed the coffee maker's frayed cord between his palms, frustrated by another sleepless night filled with whispers in languages that shouldn't exist. The Spanish moss outside his window had thrashed against the glass until dawn, driven by winds that carried the salt-sweet smell of approaching rain. Another storm was building over the Gulf. The coffee machine sputtered to life. He stared at his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of manual labor around the parish. The burn mark from where he'd grabbed the communion chalice too close to the flame last month, gone. The arthritis that had plagued his knuckles every morning for the past 5 years, absent. He'd noticed these small changes over the weeks, but dismissed them as residual effects of whatever had happened in that hospital room. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Through the rectory's front window, he could see Mrs. Evangeline Boudreau standing on his porch, her grandson Tommy cradled in her arms. The boy's left leg jutted at an unnatural angle beneath his Spider-Man pajamas, the same compound fracture that had kept him bedridden for 3 months, the same break that doctors said would never heal properly due to a rare bone disease. Miguel's stomach clenched. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when desperation was involved. "Father Santos?" Her voice cracked through the screen door. "I know it's early, but Tommy, he's been asking for you. Been asking for weeks now, ever since what happened at the church." He approached the door slowly, his bare feet silent on the rectory's warped hardwood floors. Through the screen he could see the hope burning fierce and fragile in Evangeline's eyes, the same expression he'd worn 17 months ago when he'd knelt beside his brother Carlos in that hospital room, begging God for just one miracle, just one sign that faith meant something in a world that ground good men into dust. God had been silent then. Carlos died with construction cement still embedded in his lungs. "Mrs. Boudreau," Miguel began. But the words died as Tommy lifted his head from his grandmother's shoulder. The boy's face was pale from months of pain medication, his dark eyes too large and knowing for a child of 7. But when he saw Miguel, something shifted in his expression. Not hope exactly, but recognition, as if he'd been waiting. "Father Miguel," Tommy whispered, extending a small hand through the screen. "The lady told me you could help." Miguel's blood turned cold. "What lady?" "The one in the church. She talks to you too, doesn't she?" Before Miguel could respond, Tommy's fingers brushed against his palm through the screen door's mesh. The contact lasted less than a second, but Miguel felt it, a warmth that started in his chest and flowed down through his arms like heated honey. The sensation was intoxicating, terrifying, completely beyond his understanding. Tommy gasped. Evangeline nearly dropped her grandson as the boy's legs straightened with a sound like branches settling after wind. Tommy scrambled down from her arms and took 3 tentative steps on the porch, then broke into a run toward the church, his laughter echoing off the storm-heavy morning air. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Evangeline breathed, falling to her knees on the porch boards. "Father, what are you?" Miguel stepped backward into the rectory's shadows, his hands trembling. Through the kitchen window, he could see the spire of Our Lady of Sorrows rising above the live oaks, its newly repaired roof gleaming wet in the pre-dawn light. Somewhere inside that church, the statue waited in its alcove, surrounded by flowers that never seemed to wilt and candles that burned longer than wax should allow. The statue with its knowing smile and its tears of blood. The statue that whispered secrets about his family in words that tasted ancient on his tongue. "I don't know," he told Evangeline, and the honesty of it cut him deeper than any lie could have. Tommy's joyful shouting grew fainter as he raced toward the church grounds, but Miguel could still hear him calling, "She was right, the lady was right." Miguel closed the front door and leaned against it, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs. Outside, thunder rumbled across the gulf, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, though he knew for certain he'd locked the bell tower after the hurricane damage. The storms were coming again, and this time, Miguel suspected they would bring more than just wind and rain. Miguel stood frozen against the door for several minutes, listening to Evangeline's whispered prayers fade as she followed her grandson toward the church. The coffee maker continued its cheerful gurgling in the kitchen, a mundane sound that felt grotesquely out of place in a world where 7-year-old boys could be healed with a touch. He forced himself to move, padding back to the kitchen on unsteady legs. The coffee was ready, dark and bitter, the way Carlos used to make it during their childhood mornings before school. Miguel poured a cup with hands that barely shook, a small victory he clung to as everything else spiraled beyond his comprehension. 6:15 a.m. In 90 minutes, he would celebrate morning mass for the dozen or so regulars who still attended despite the circus that had consumed their parish. Mrs. Hebert with her arthritic knees, always in the third pew. Old Mr. Tran, whose Vietnamese prayers blended beautifully with Latin during the Kyrie. The Landry family, who'd been coming since their youngest daughter recovered from leukemia 3 years ago, long before any of this strangeness began. These people were his anchor, his reminder of why he'd chosen the priesthood 24 years ago, before the doubts, before Carlos died choking on his own blood in a charity hospital bed, before Miguel had started questioning whether God existed at all, or if he simply didn't care about construction workers and small-town priests and the quiet desperation that filled the spaces between Sunday services. Miguel sipped his coffee and began his morning routine, the familiar motions a meditation against the chaos. Shower first. The rectory's ancient plumbing groaned and spat rust-colored water for 30 seconds before clearing. Shave with the straight razor his father had given him at ordination, the blade worn smooth by decades of use. Black pants, black shirt, white collar, the uniform that had once felt like armor and now seemed thin as paper. By 7:30, he was walking the narrow path between the rectory and Our Lady of Sorrows, breathing in the heavy morning air that tasted of salt and approaching rain. The church grounds showed signs of the recent attention. Trampled grass where news vans had parked, cigarette butts near the cemetery fence, a forgotten crutch leaning against the ancient live oak that had sheltered this place since before Louisiana was a state. The church itself rose before him like a prayer made manifest in wood and stone. Built in 1623 by Spanish missionaries, it had survived hurricanes, floods, yellow fever epidemics, and 2 centuries of benign neglect. Miguel had served here for 8 years, long enough to know every creaking floorboard and every leak in the roof. This building was his life's work, his purpose, his home, and now it felt like a trap. He unlocked the heavy oak doors and stepped inside, immediately assaulted by the scent of roses, too strong, too sweet, emanating from the alcove where she waited. The Virgin Mary statue stood in her place of honor, carved from cypress wood that had somehow never rotted despite the coastal humidity. Her face bore the serene expression of maternal love that had comforted parishioners for 4 centuries, but her eyes seemed to track his movement as he walked down the center aisle. Miguel forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the practical preparations for Mass. Light the altar candles, check the readings for the day, something from Matthew about faith-moving mountains, which struck him as cosmically inappropriate. Arrange the communion wafers in their golden pattern, pour the wine that would become the blood of Christ. The blood of Christ. He thought of the crimson tears that had begun flowing from the statue's eyes 6 weeks ago. The same night he'd walked out of Mercy General Hospital on legs that should have been paralyzed forever. The diocese had sent investigators, serious men with clipboards and cameras who'd tested the substance and found it to be human blood, type AB negative, the same type that flowed through Miguel's own veins. The diocese was looking into the matter. Archbishop Thibodeau had advised patience and discretion. The Vatican had not yet responded to their carefully worded report. Meanwhile, the statue wept, and Miguel's hands healed broken bones, and somewhere in the deepest part of his soul, he felt something vast and ancient stirring to wakefulness. At 8 a.m. exactly, Mrs. Hebert arrived for Mass, moving slowly but steadily down the aisle to her usual pew. Mr. Tran followed 5 minutes later, nodding respectfully before taking his place in the back. The Landrys came as a family unit, their youngest daughter, healthy now for 3 years, carrying flowers for the altar. These good people trusted him to shepherd their souls, to intercede between them and the divine mystery that governed their lives. They had no idea that their priest was becoming something he couldn't name or understand, something that might be miraculous or monstrous, or both. Miguel took his place at the altar, opened his missal, and began the ancient words that had once brought him peace. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. In the alcove, he could swear he heard the statue whisper along in perfect Latin. Miguel's voice faltered mid-blessing, as the whisper reached him clearly this time. Not imagination, not the product of sleepless nights, but actual words spoken in a voice like wind through autumn leaves. The handful of parishioners stirred uneasily in their pews, sensing something amiss, though they couldn't have heard what he heard. He cleared his throat and continued the Mass, but his eyes kept drifting to the alcove where the Virgin statue stood bathed in morning light. The scent of roses had grown so intense it made his head swim. Mrs. Hebert fanned herself with her prayer book, and even Mr. Tran glanced toward the statue with a puzzled expression. The Mass proceeded with mechanical precision. Gospel reading, homily about faith that felt hollow in his mouth, the consecration of bread and wine into body and blood, while actual blood wept from wooden eyes. When the time came for communion, Miguel's hands trembled as he placed each wafer on outstretched tongues, terrified that his touch might change these faithful people in ways neither he nor they could understand. Corpus Christi, he murmured to Mrs. Hebert. Amen, she replied. But as her lips brushed his fingertip, he felt that familiar warmth flow between them. She straightened slightly, the chronic stoop in her shoulders easing for the first time in years. By the final blessing, Miguel was barely holding himself together. The parishioners filed out with their usual quiet reverence, though Mrs. Hebert paused at the door to stretch her back with obvious amazement. The Landry girl skipped rather than walked, her steps lighter than they'd been since her long illness. Alone with the statue, Miguel approached the alcove on unsteady legs. The Virgin's face remained serene, but the tears flowing down her cheeks had thickened. leaving dark stains on the ancient cypress wood. At the base of the pedestal, fresh flowers lay in careful arrangement, roses that bloomed impossibly bright despite the approaching storm, their petals soft as velvet and red as fresh blood. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but in images that flooded his mind like rushing water. He saw his great-grandmother, Maria Santos, a woman he'd never met, kneeling before this same statue in 1943. He saw his grandfather, Eduardo, making some sort of pact spoken in Spanish and something older, darker. He saw generations of Santos men serving this church, tending this statue, keeping secrets that had been buried with their bones. And he saw something else, a shadow approaching from the east, moving across the gulf with purpose and malevolent intelligence. The storm building on the horizon was no natural weather pattern, but a manifestation of something that had been waiting, watching, biding its time for decades. The visions shattered as the church doors burst open behind him. Father Santos! Miguel spun to find a young woman stumbling down the aisle, her designer clothes soaked with rain that hadn't been falling when the parishioners left 10 minutes ago. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair plastered to her skull and eyes that held the same desperate hope he'd seen in too many faces lately. Behind her came two men in expensive suits, their movements predatory despite their polite expressions. They flanked the entrance like guards, though they made no move to follow the woman inside. "Please," she gasped, falling to her knees before the altar. "My daughter, she's dying. The doctors say hours, maybe less. Someone told me about this place, about you. They said you could—" She broke off, sobbing, but Miguel was barely listening. His attention was fixed on the men by the door, something about them setting every instinct ablaze with warning. They stood too still, breathed too quietly, and their eyes reflected the candlelight like an animal's. "What's your name?" he asked the woman gently, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all wrong, that her arrival was no coincidence. "Elena Vasquez. My daughter Carmen is at Mercy General, room 314. The same room where you—" She looked up at him with streaming eyes. "Please, Father, I know what you can do. I know about the miracles." One of the men by the door shifted slightly, and Miguel caught a glimpse of something metallic beneath his jacket, not a weapon, something else. Something that made the air around him taste of copper and ozone. The statue's whispers grew urgent, a rapid stream of words in that ancient language he was beginning to understand despite himself. Warning, danger, choose carefully. Miguel looked from the desperate mother to the waiting men to the weeping virgin, feeling the weight of decision crushing down on him like that steel beam 6 weeks ago. He could refuse, turn the woman away, pretend his hands were just flesh and bone. He could try to return to the simple life of a parish priest struggling with ordinary faith, or he could follow this path deeper into mystery and power, accepting whatever he was becoming, even if it damned his soul. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing the stained glass windows with increasing fury. In the alcove, the Virgin's tears flowed faster, and somewhere in the darkness gathering beyond the church walls, Miguel sensed vast things stirring to wakefulness. Elena Vasquez waited for his answer, while the men by the door waited for something else entirely. Miguel's mouth opened, then closed, the words dying in his throat like prayers spoken to an empty sky. Elena Vasquez knelt before him with her hands clasped, rain still dripping from her hair onto the worn stone floor, while behind her those two men waited with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Aye," he began, then stopped. His hands, those treacherous instruments of impossible healing, hung at his sides like dead weight. "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm not. What people are saying about me, it's not." But even as he spoke, he could feel the lie crumbling. Tommy Boudreau was somewhere outside right now, running on legs that had been broken beyond repair just hours ago. Mrs. Hebert had walked out of this church straighter than she'd stood in years. The evidence of what he'd become was written in flesh and bone, undeniable as the blood weeping from wooden eyes. "Please," Elena whispered. "Carmen is only 8 years old. She has leukemia. It came back worse than before. The doctors, they've done everything they can." Her voice broke on the words. "You're my last hope." Miguel's chest constricted. 8 years old, the same age Carlos had been when he'd fallen from that oak tree behind their childhood home, breaking his arm so badly the bone pierced through skin. Miguel had been 12 then, old enough to understand that his little brother might die if they couldn't get him to a hospital 60 miles away through flooding roads. He'd knelt in that muddy yard, pressing his hands to the wound and praying harder than he ever had before or since, begging God to save the only family he had left. No miracle had come that day. Carlos survived through the skill of human doctors and the grace of good fortune, not divine intervention. But Miguel never forgot the helpless terror of watching someone he loved slip away while he remained powerless to stop it. Now, power coursed through his veins like liquid fire, and he was terrified to use it. "What if I make it worse?" The words escaped before he could stop them. What if whatever this is, whatever I've become, what if it hurts her instead of helping? Elena's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. You've healed people. Everyone knows." "I've touched 3 people." Miguel cut her off, his voice harsh with self-recrimination. "A boy with a broken leg, an old woman with arthritis, maybe Mrs. Landry during communion if what I felt was even real. What if those were flukes? What if the next person I touch—" He gestured helplessly at his hands. "I don't understand what's happening to me. I don't know how to control it." The statue's whispers rose to a crescendo, urgent words in that ancient tongue flowing through his consciousness. But understanding the language and trusting its source were different things entirely. What if the voice guiding him belonged not to the Mother of God but to something else, something that wore her face like a mask while pursuing its own incomprehensible agenda? One of the men by the door took a step forward, and Miguel caught the scent that followed him. Ozone and copper, yes, but underneath that, something else. Sulfur, the smell of matches struck in darkness, of chemistry experiments gone wrong, of things that shouldn't exist in a world governed by natural law. "I need time," Miguel said, backing away from Elena toward the altar, "to pray, to think. This isn't a decision I can make lightly." "Time?" Elena scrambled to her feet, desperation making her voice shrill. "My daughter doesn't have time. She could be dead before—" "Then take her to the hospital," Miguel snapped, then immediately felt ashamed of his harshness. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I'm a priest, not a doctor, not a miracle worker. I don't even know if I believe in miracles anymore." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Elena stared at him with something approaching horror, as if he'd just announced his intention to burn down the church. Behind her, the 2 men exchanged glances that spoke of calculations and contingencies. "The blood," Elena said slowly. "The statue that weeps blood. The boy who was healed this morning. My contacts told me about him before I came here. You think those are coincidences?" Miguel looked toward the alcove where the Virgin stood, her tears flowing steadier now, pooling at the base of the pedestal like an offering or an accusation. The scent of roses had grown cloying, oppressive, mixing with the sulfur smell from the waiting men until he could barely breathe. "I think," he said carefully, "that there are forces at work here I don't understand, and until I do understand them, until I know whether this power comes from God or somewhere else entirely, I can't risk using it on a dying child." Elena's face crumpled. She turned away from him, toward the men who waited with their metallic secrets and their predator's patience. "Then you're not the man I was told you were." Thunder rolled across the gulf, and in the alcove the Virgin's tears flowed like a crimson river, while her wooden lips seemed to curve in something that might have been disappointment. The words struck Miguel like physical blows. "Not the man I was told you were." How many times had he heard variations of that phrase throughout his life? His father, disappointed in a son who chose seminary over the family construction business. Carlos, in those final bitter weeks before the accident, angry that his older brother had abandoned him for a god who seemed increasingly absent from their lives. Archbishop Thibodeau, whose carefully neutral tone during their last conversation had carried unmistakable currents of doubt. And now this desperate mother, turning away from him toward men who reeked of sulfur and carried mysteries beneath their expensive suits. "Wait," Miguel heard himself say, the word tearing from his throat like a confession. "Wait." Elena paused, her hand already reaching toward one of the men. In that moment, Miguel saw himself with devastating clarity, a middle-aged priest paralyzed by fear, choosing safety over service while an 8-year-old girl died because he was too much of a coward to risk the unknown. What would Carlos think of him now? His brother had never understood Miguel's calling, but he'd respected the courage it took to dedicate a life to something larger than oneself. "At least you're not afraid to bet everything on what you believe," Carlos had said once, years before bitterness poisoned their relationship. "That takes guts, hermano." Miguel walked down the aisle toward Elena, each step feeling like a small death. The men flanking the entrance watched his approach with inhuman stillness, their presence making the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. But it was the statue's whispers that gave him strength, urgent, melodious words that he finally allowed himself to understand. "Hijo de la sangre, son of the blood, your time has come." "Mrs. Vasquez," he said quietly, "take me to your daughter." Elena spun around, hope blazing in her eyes like candlelight. "You'll come? You'll try?" "I'll try." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but I need you to understand. I don't know what will happen. I don't know if this power comes from God or something else entirely. If you're willing to take that risk." "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, whatever the risk." One of the men stepped forward, his movement liquid and predatory. "Father Santos, perhaps we should discuss." Miguel's voice carried an authority he'd never possessed before, resonating through the church like a bell. "Whatever you want, whoever sent you, it can wait. There's a dying child who needs help now." The man's eyes flashed with something that might have been irritation or approval. "As you wish, Father. But understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Miguel met his gaze steadily. "I crossed that threshold 6 weeks ago when I woke up in a hospital bed with legs that should have been crushed. This is just the next step." Thunder crashed overhead as if the storm itself was responding to his decision. Rain hammered the stained glass windows with increasing fury, turning the colored light dancing across the nave into something wild and chaotic. In the alcove, the Virgin's tears flowed faster, crimson rivulets streaming down her wooden cheeks to pool among the blood-red roses at her feet. Miguel grabbed his jacket from the sacristy and followed Elena toward the entrance, walking between the two men who watched him with expressions that held too much knowledge and too little humanity. As they reached the doors, one of them spoke in a voice like grinding metal. "The hospital is being watched, Father. Others know what you are becoming. Tonight's choice will determine which side of an ancient war you serve." "Tonight's choice," Miguel replied, pulling open the heavy oak doors to face the storm, "is about saving a child's life. Everything else can go to hell." The wind caught his words and scattered them into the darkness beyond the church grounds, where lightning illuminated the Spanish moss hanging from ancient trees like funeral shrouds. Miguel stepped into the rain, leaving behind the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 8 years, crossing from the world he'd known into something vast and dangerous and utterly unknown. Behind him, the Virgin's statue wept tears of blood that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and somewhere in the deepest part of his soul, Miguel felt the last of his ordinary life burning away like paper in fire. There would be no going back now, no return to simple faith and quiet service. He was something new now, something unprecedented. Whether that made him a saint or a monster remained to be seen. The storm swallowed him whole as Elena led him toward a sleek black car, idling in the church parking lot, its engine purring like a satisfied predator. The men followed in perfect silence, their presence a reminder that Miguel's choice had consequences beyond anything he could imagine. In the distance, Mercy General Hospital waited like a judgment, and in room 314, an 8-year-old girl lay dying while forces older than Louisiana itself gathered to witness what Father Miguel Santos would become. The black car's interior smelled of leather and something Miguel couldn't identify, ozone mixed with incense, like a church struck by lightning. Elena sat rigid beside him, her hands knotted in her lap as the vehicle glided through streets flooded with more than just rainwater. The storm had transformed San Esperanza into something primordial, where streetlights flickered like dying stars and shadows moved with purpose between the buildings. Miguel watched the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror and felt his stomach clench. The man's eyes held no light whatsoever, not even the reflection of passing headlights. Just empty darkness, like looking into abandoned wells. "How long has Carmen been sick?" Miguel asked Elena, desperate to focus on something human and real. 2 years since the first diagnosis. She went into remission for 8 months, but it came back in May. Elena's voice cracked. "Worse than before. The doctors say her body can't handle another round of chemotherapy. They're just trying to make her comfortable now." Comfortable. The euphemism doctors used when medicine had reached its limits, and all that remained was the long slide toward darkness. Miguel had heard it too many times during his years of hospital ministry, had watched too many families accept that terrible word like a benediction. "Tell me about her," he said. Elena's face softened despite her terror. "She loves horses, draws them constantly. These beautiful, impossible horses with wings and horns and manes like fire. She says when she gets better, she's going to have a ranch where sick children can ride magical horses until they're healed." Fresh tears joined the rain on her cheeks. She still believes in magic, Father. Even dying, she believes good things are possible. The car turned into Mercy General's parking garage, and Miguel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud. Through the concrete walls, he could sense something vast and watchful, as if the hospital itself had become aware of his approach. His hands tingled with that familiar warmth, but underneath it ran currents of something else, power that felt ancient and hungry and not entirely benevolent. They rode the elevator to the 3rd floor in silence. The fluorescent lights flickered as they passed each floor, and Miguel noticed that other passengers gave them a wide berth without seeming to realize they were doing so. The 2 men flanked him like honor guards, their presence creating ripples of unease that spread through the confined space. Room 314 stood at the end of a corridor that seemed to stretch longer with each step. Miguel could hear medical equipment humming behind the door, ventilators, monitors, the mechanical chorus that accompanied modern dying. But underneath those familiar sounds, something else whispered, the labored breathing of a child fighting a battle she was destined to lose. Elena's hand trembled as she pushed open the door. Carmen Vasquez lay surrounded by machines, her small body nearly lost among the tubes and wires that tethered her to life. She was beautiful despite her illness, with her mother's dark eyes and skin pale as candle wax. But it was her drawings that made Miguel's breath catch. Dozens of them taped to the walls, each depicting horses that seemed to move in the shifting light, creatures of impossible grace dancing across paper skies. "Mama?" Carmen's voice was barely a whisper. "You brought the priest." Elena rushed to her daughter's bedside. "Yes, baby. Father Santos is here to help you." Carmen studied Miguel with eyes too old for her face. "You're scared," she observed with the brutal honesty of children. "The horses told me you'd be scared." "The horses told you?" Miguel approached slowly, his hands beginning to burn with contained energy. "In my dreams, they said a man would come who could touch death and make it go away, but first he had to stop being afraid of becoming something different." She reached out with fingers thin as bird bones. "Are you ready to not be afraid?" Miguel looked down at this dying child who spoke of magic horses and transformation, feeling the last of his resistance crumble. Behind him, he sensed the 2 men watching with predatory intensity, while Elena held her breath like a prayer. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the storm raged with unnatural fury, and in the deepest part of his soul, that ancient voice whispered words of encouragement or damnation. He sat on the edge of the bed and took Carmen's hand in both of his own. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into light and shadow, wonder and terror. Miguel felt power pour out of him like water from a broken dam, but it wasn't the gentle warmth he'd experienced before. This was something vast and wild, a force that rewrote reality at the cellular level while showing him visions that defied comprehension. He saw the cancer consuming Carmen's bone marrow, but also the golden threads of possibility that could unmake it. He felt the presence of those watching men, no longer human but something far older. And deepest of all, he glimpsed the true nature of what he was becoming. Not saint or monster, but something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had been separate since the dawn of creation. Carmen's eyes widened as healing fire raced through her veins, and Miguel Santos crossed another threshold from which there could be no return. The healing light faded gradually, leaving Miguel gasping as if he'd just surfaced from deep water. Carmen's grip on his hands had strengthened during their connection, her fingers no longer resembling fragile twigs, but those of a healthy child. Color bloomed in her cheeks like sunrise, and the monitors around her bed began registering vital signs that made Elena sob with relief. But Miguel barely heard her tears of joy. The visions he'd experienced during the healing continued to cascade through his consciousness, fragments of impossible knowledge that rearranged everything he thought he understood about his purpose. He'd seen something vast and ancient stirring beneath the foundations of reality, and Carmen's recovery was merely the first note in a symphony that would reshape the world. "The horses," Carmen whispered, her voice stronger now. "They're singing." One of the men stepped closer to the bed, and Miguel finally understood what he was seeing in their inhuman stillness. Not demons, not angels, but something else entirely, watchers from a realm that existed parallel to their own, drawn by the emergence of power that shouldn't exist in human hands. "Father Santos," the taller man said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in Miguel's bones. "You begin to see." Elena looked between them in confusion, still clutching her daughter's transformed hand. "I don't understand. Who are these men? How did they know about—" "They've been watching me," Miguel said quietly, standing on legs that trembled with exhaustion. The healing had drained him more completely than before, but it had also opened doors in his mind that could never be closed. "Haven't you? Since the accident? Since I woke up changed?" The second man nodded. "The bloodline awakens only in times of great need. Your ancestor made a pact centuries ago, binding his descendants to serve as bridges when the barriers between worlds grow thin. The storm outside is not merely weather, Father. It heralds the approach of something that will test the foundations of existence itself." Miguel felt the truth of those words resonating in his altered DNA, in the power that flowed through his veins like liquid starlight. What kind of pact? One that preserved humanity when it should have fallen to forces beyond your comprehension. Your bloodline carries the ability to channel divine energy into physical form, to heal what should not be healed, and protect what cannot protect itself. But such gifts come with obligations. Carmen sat up in her hospital bed, her recovery nothing short of miraculous. "The horses say there are dark riders coming, Father Miguel. They need someone who can stand between the worlds and hold the door closed." The casual way she spoke of impossible things chilled Miguel more than the Watcher's revelations. Through his healing touch, he'd apparently awakened abilities in Carmen that allowed her to perceive the same hidden realities that now tortured his own awareness. He'd saved her life, but at what cost? Elena backed away from the bed, finally sensing the otherworldly currents flowing around them. "What have you done to my daughter?" "I've given her the ability to see what's coming," Miguel said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "And I've marked her as part of whatever this is. We're all part of it now." Thunder crashed outside with such violence that the hospital windows rattled in their frames. The lights flickered, and in that moment of semi-darkness, Miguel glimpsed shapes moving in the storm, things with too many wings and eyes like burning coals, circling the building like vultures around carrion. "They smell the power you've released," the first watcher said. "Your healing of the child has sent ripples across multiple dimensions. Those who would see this world consumed by chaos now know exactly where to find the bridge between realms." Miguel's hands clenched into fists, power crackling beneath his skin like caged lightning. "Then they'll find me ready for them." But even as he spoke those words, doubt gnawed at him. He was a parish priest from a forgotten Louisiana town, not some cosmic guardian. The statue's whispers had grown silent since Carmen's healing, leaving him without guidance just when he needed it most. What if the power flowing through him wasn't divine at all, but something else wearing heaven's mask? "The choice approaches, Father," the second watcher said. "Sanctuary cannot protect you much longer. You must decide whether to embrace your destiny or watch everything you've sworn to protect crumble into darkness." Carmen reached for her sketchpad with hands steady for the first time in months, her pencil moving across the paper with feverish intensity. When she turned it toward them, Miguel's blood turned to ice. She'd drawn the interior of Our Lady of Sorrows church, but the Virgin's statue was gone, replaced by something with burning eyes and teeth like broken glass. Around it knelt figures in tattered robes, offering prayers to an entity that definitely wasn't Mary. "They're already there," Carmen said simply, "waiting for you to come home." Miguel stared at Carmen's drawing, his mouth going dry as ash. The thing she'd sketched where the Virgin Mary should have been writhed on the page as if alive, its impossible geometry shifting between dimensions. The robed figures surrounding it seemed to whisper prayers in languages that predated human speech, their devotions rising like smoke from burning flesh. "We have to go back," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "Now." Elena pressed herself against the hospital room wall, clutching at normalcy even as it crumbled around her. "You can't leave. Carmen she needs—" "Your daughter is no longer in danger from her illness," the first watcher interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But what waits at Our Lady of Sorrows threatens far more than one child's life." Miguel's hands shook as power surged through him unbidden, responding to his terror. The fluorescent lights above began to strobe, casting everything in stark, epileptic flashes that made the watchers' forms blur between human and something far more alien. He could feel the wrongness spreading from the church like an infection, corruption seeping into the spiritual foundations of San Esperanza itself. "How long do we have?" he asked. Carmen's pencil moved across a fresh page without her conscious direction, her newly awakened sight channeling visions directly onto paper. "They're calling something through, using your church, your sacred space." She looked up with eyes that held depths no 8-year-old should possess. "But they need you there to complete the ritual, your blood, your power." The second watcher nodded grimly. "The entities that have taken sanctuary in your church cannot fully manifest without a conduit. Your healing abilities make you the perfect bridge between dimensions, divine enough to channel celestial energy, human enough to anchor it in physical reality." Miguel felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. Return to the church and provide the final component for some cosmic abomination's arrival. Stay away and watch helplessly as corruption spread through everything he'd sworn to protect. Either choice led to damnation. "There has to be another way," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Lightning struck the hospital directly above them, the thunder so close it seemed to originate from within the walls themselves. The windows cracked in spiderweb patterns, and through the fractured glass Miguel glimpsed shapes moving in the storm clouds, things with too many limbs and mouths that split reality like wounds. The barriers between worlds were weakening with every moment he delayed. Elena grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "You saved Carmen. You brought her back from death itself. You have to have enough power to stop whatever this is." "Power without understanding is just destruction," Miguel said, remembering his seminary training in exorcism protocols. "I don't even know what I'm fighting," These abilities, this bloodline connection, I've had them for 6 weeks. How am I supposed to stand against forces that are older than civilization?" Carmen set down her pencil and looked at him with preternatural calm. "The horses say you're asking the wrong question, Father Miguel." "What's the right question?" "Not whether you can stop them, whether you're willing to become what it takes to try." The words hit Miguel like physical blows, echoing the choice that had haunted him since he'd first awakened to changed reality. Every step of his transformation had required letting go of who he'd been before. The paralyzed priest, the doubtful servant, the man who chose safety over service. Now the final metamorphosis waited, and he could sense its terrible requirements, lurking just beyond conscious understanding. "What will I become?" he asked the watchers. "Something unprecedented," the first replied. "Your bloodline has never faced a challenge of this magnitude. The power required to seal a dimensional breach of this size will either elevate you beyond human limitations or destroy you completely. And if I'm destroyed, then the entities now corrupting your church will have a permanent foothold in this reality. From there, they will spread like cancer until everything you recognize is consumed by chaos." Miguel closed his eyes and reached out with his enhanced senses, feeling for the church that had been his home and sanctuary for 8 years. What he found made his soul recoil in horror. Our Lady of Sorrows had become something else entirely, a wound in the fabric of existence, bleeding darkness into the world. The Virgin's statue, once a symbol of divine compassion, now served as an anchor point for malevolence that defied description. But underneath the corruption, he sensed something else, a presence vast and patient, divine power that had been waiting for this moment since before his birth. The true source of his abilities, perhaps. The force that had preserved his family's bloodline through centuries of hidden purpose. "The choice approaches rapidly, Father," the second watcher warned. "The ritual reaches its crescendo. Soon, intervention will be impossible." Miguel opened his eyes and looked at Carmen, seeing in her face both the miracle he'd accomplished and the responsibility it entailed. She was alive because he'd been willing to risk everything on faith. Now faith demanded the ultimate sacrifice, not his life, but his humanity itself. "Take me home," he said quietly. The ride back to San Esperanza stretched endlessly through the hurricane-torn night. Miguel sat rigid in the passenger seat of Elena's car, watching through cracked windows as the storm transformed familiar Louisiana highways into alien landscapes of twisted metal and uprooted trees. The watchers flanked him in the back seat, their inhuman stillness making the confined space feel like a tomb. With each mile that brought them closer to Our Lady of Sorrows, Miguel's connection to the church intensified. The corruption he'd sensed from the hospital now felt like acid in his veins, a constant burning that made his hands shake uncontrollably. Power surged through him in erratic waves, responding to his terror and the proximity of whatever had invaded his sanctuary. "Stop the car!" he gasped as they reached the town limits. Elena pulled over beside a fallen oak that had crushed a roadside shrine. In the twisted wreckage of ceramic saints and plastic flowers, Miguel could see the future. Everything sacred reduced to debris, everything wholly consumed by forces that treated divine love as nothing more than fuel for their hunger. "I can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I can feel them in there, wearing the faces of my parishioners. They've turned my church into an abattoir." Through the storm, the bell tower of Our Lady of Sorrows was visible in the distance, but its familiar silhouette had changed. The cross atop the spire now bent at impossible angles, and lights flickered in the windows, not the warm glow of votive candles, but the cold phosphorescence of decay. Shadows moved behind the stained glass with predatory purpose, and Miguel realized with sickening clarity that he was already too late. "They're using the children," he said, the knowledge arriving like a blade between his ribs. "Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, the Tran family's daughter, all the ones I've been healing, they've gathered them in the sanctuary." The first watcher leaned forward, his voice carrying harmonics that made Miguel's teeth ache. "The ritual requires innocent blood touched by divine power. Your healing marked them as perfect sacrifices. Miguel's stomach emptied onto the rain-soaked asphalt as the full horror hit him. Every miracle he'd performed, every life he'd saved, all of it had been preparation for this moment. The entities hadn't invaded his church. They'd been invited in by his own misguided compassion, using his desperate need to heal as a weapon against everything he cherished. "Carmen," Elena said from the driver's seat, her voice hollow with understanding. "That's why they wanted you to heal Carmen. Not to mark her, but to prove you'd sacrifice anything to save a child." The second watcher nodded with something approaching sympathy. "Your bloodline's greatest strength has always been your willingness to suffer for others. But that same nobility makes you predictable. They knew you would heal the dying girl, even if it meant revealing your location to every predator in existence." Miguel struggled to his feet, power crackling around him like broken lightning. In the distance, the church bells began to toll. Not the familiar bronze voice he'd heard for 8 years, but a sound like screaming metal that set his bones vibrating in resonance with otherworldly frequencies. Each toll marked another step in a ritual designed to tear reality apart at its most vulnerable point. "How many?" he asked, dreading the answer. 17 children, the first watcher replied, all under the age of 12, all bearing the mark of your healing touch. Their combined innocence will anchor the dimensional breach permanently in your reality. Elena grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "We have to call the police, the National Guard, someone with actual weapons." "Weapons are useless against entities that exist partially outside physical law," Miguel said, understanding flooding through him like poison. "This was always meant to be my choice alone. Face them as I am and fail completely, or become something that might succeed at the cost of my own soul." The church bells tolled again, and this time Miguel felt the sound physically, each note carving pieces away from his sanity as visions of the children's terror burned across his consciousness. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, only 7 years old, had wet himself in fear but still clutched the rosary Miguel had blessed for him. The Tran girl, barely 5, called for her mother in Vietnamese, while creatures wearing human faces whispered promises of pain that would last forever. "They're starting," he said, collapsing against Elena's car as the weight of cosmic horror pressed down on him. "I can hear their prayers, not to God, to the things crawling through the cracks between worlds." The watchers exchanged glances heavy with significance. "The transformation we spoke of, it carries no guarantee of victory, Father, only the possibility of meaningful resistance. You may sacrifice your humanity and still fail to save those children." Miguel closed his eyes and felt 17 young hearts beating in terror, their innocent faith in his protection about to be betrayed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Everything he'd worked for, everyone he'd tried to save, all of it crumbling into darkness while he stood paralyzed by choices that offered only different flavors of damnation. The bells tolled a third time, and Miguel Santos finally understood that some battles were lost before they even began. The fourth toll of the bells shattered something fundamental inside Miguel's mind, and with that breaking came a flood of memories that weren't his own. Images cascaded through his consciousness like a dam bursting, his great-grandfather kneeling before a burning cathedral in 1847, accepting a bargain written in languages that predated human speech. His grandfather standing guard at a crossroads in rural Mexico as things with too many teeth tried to claw their way through dimensional barriers. His father, dying young and broken, whispering warnings about bloodline curses that Miguel had dismissed as fever dreams. "We were never priests by choice," he gasped, understanding finally tearing through him like cold fire. The calling, the seminary, the assignment to this church, none of it was coincidence. The first watcher inclined his head with something approaching respect. "Your family has served as guardians for 7 generations, each generation producing one son capable of channeling divine energy into physical form, each stationed at a location where the barriers between worlds grow thin. Your predecessors faced smaller incursions, individual entities seeking entrance, minor tears in reality's fabric. But this is different, Miguel said, the words coming from inherited knowledge buried in his DNA. This is the convergence the pact was made to prevent. Lightning split the sky directly above Our Lady of Sorrows, revealing shapes in the storm clouds that hurt to perceive directly. The church itself seemed to pulse like a diseased heart, its walls breathing with malevolent life as the ritual within reached crescendo. Through his supernatural awareness, Miguel felt the children's terror intensifying, their prayers shifting from words of faith to wordless screams as reality unraveled around them. Elena stared at him with growing horror as power began emanating from his skin in visible waves. "What are you becoming?" "What I was always meant to become," Miguel replied, his voice taking on harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. The transformation was starting whether he willed it or not, triggered by proximity to the dimensional breach and the desperate need of the innocence trapped within. His human limitations were burning away like tissue paper in a furnace, replaced by something vast and terrible and utterly foreign to everything he'd believed about himself. The watchers stepped back as golden light began pouring from Miguel's eyes, their forms flickering between human appearance and something far more alien. "The choice point has passed, Father. Your bloodline's purpose activates automatically when the threshold is crossed. You can guide the transformation or let it consume you, but you cannot stop it." Miguel felt his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of his skull, stretching across dimensions he hadn't known existed. The power flowing through him wasn't divine, not in any way he'd understood divinity. It was older than Christianity, older than any human religion, a force that treated concepts like good and evil as irrelevant abstractions. What he'd mistaken for miraculous healing had been this alien energy expressing itself through the only framework his mind could accept. "The Virgin never spoke to me," he realized with crushing clarity. "It was this thing, this power, wearing the face of something I could trust." Through the church windows, he saw the truth of what waited inside. The children knelt in a perfect circle around something that wore the Virgin Mary's form but moved with predatory hunger. Their innocent blood had already been spilled, marking geometric patterns on the sanctuary floor that opened doorways between realities. And standing at the altar, conducting the ritual with fevered intensity, was Father Miguel Santos, or something wearing his face with perfect accuracy. "Doppelganger," the second watcher confirmed, "created from the same force that grants your healing abilities. It has been preparing this ritual since the moment you first awakened to power, using your love for these children as fuel for their destruction." Miguel's human personality screamed in horror as the transformation accelerated. His body was changing at the cellular level, becoming something capable of channeling energies that would incinerate ordinary flesh. But with each shift away from humanity came a corresponding loss of the emotions that had defined his existence. Compassion dimming to cold calculation. Love transmuting into mere strategic consideration. The fifth toll of the bells announced the ritual's final phase. Inside the church, the false Miguel raised a ceremonial blade above 7-year-old Roberto Rodriguez, and the real Miguel felt his last vestiges of human hesitation incinerate in the fire of absolute necessity. "I understand now," he said, his voice carrying frequencies that made the storm itself pause in recognition. The pact wasn't made to preserve humanity. It was made to create something that could choose humanity over cosmic indifference when the moment came. Power erupted from him in a column of light that pierced the storm clouds and sent the circling entities shrieking back into whatever dimensions had spawned them. But as divine energy coursed through his transforming body, Miguel realized with terrible clarity that saving the children would require them to become something they would rightfully fear for the rest of their lives. The final choice crystallized before him: remain human and watch innocence die, or become a monster capable of protecting them from worse monsters. The church bells tolled a 6th time, and Miguel Santos began walking toward his destiny. The 7th toll never came. Miguel's footsteps against the storm-slicked pavement created ripples of energy that transformed puddles into mirrors, reflecting not his face, but the faces of 7 generations of Santos men who had walked similar paths toward impossible choices. With each step toward Our Lady of Sorrows, the transformation burning through his cells began to stabilize, finding equilibrium between human consciousness and cosmic force. "Elena, stay back!" he called without turning, his voice carrying harmonics that made the rain itself bend around him. "What happens next? You can't be close enough to be caught in the overflow." But when he glanced over his shoulder, he found Elena matching his pace stride for stride, her face set with determination that reminded him painfully of his brother Carlos in the moments before the construction accident. Behind her, the watchers moved like shadows given form, their alien features now clearly visible as his enhanced perception stripped away their human disguises. "I'm not abandoning those children," Elena said, rain streaming down her face like tears. "And I'm not abandoning you, whatever you're becoming. You're still the man who brought Carmen back from death." Miguel felt something unexpected, the transformation pausing, responding to the anchor of human connection. The power still coursed through him in waves that made his bones sing with otherworldly frequencies, but Elena's presence somehow prevented it from consuming the last fragments of who he'd been before. He realized with stunning clarity that this was how his ancestors had survived their own metamorphoses, not through isolation, but through maintaining bonds to the humanity they were sworn to protect. "The Watchers," he said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise. "They're not observers, they're survivors." The first Watcher's features shifted, revealing something that might once have been human beneath layers of cosmic alteration. "We are the bloodline's previous generations, Father, transformed beyond death, existing between dimensions to guide our descendants through the same impossible choices we once faced. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and someday, if you survive this night, you will stand watch for your own descendants when their moment arrives." The revelation should have horrified him, but instead, Miguel felt a profound sense of continuity, of purpose stretching across centuries. He wasn't alone in this transformation. He was the latest link in a chain of sacrifice that had kept horrors at bay since before the founding of the Americas. The power burning through him carried the memories and experiences of every Santos man who had walked this path before him. "Show me their plan," he commanded, and the Watchers responded by opening their shared consciousness to him completely. Knowledge flooded his mind. The entities within the church were fragments of something vast and hungry that existed in the spaces between realities, feeding on the collapse of ordered worlds. They had tried repeatedly to establish footholds in Earth's dimension, only to be thwarted by guardians like his family. This convergence represented their most sophisticated attempt yet, using his own compassion as a weapon, turning his healing abilities into a marking system for perfect sacrifices. But Miguel also saw their weakness. The ritual binding them to this reality required continuous power, and that power had to come from somewhere. They were parasites, dependent on corrupting existing energy sources rather than generating their own. The false Miguel conducting the ceremony was drawing from the same cosmic force that fueled his healing. If that connection could be severed, the entire invasion would collapse. "The statue," he breathed, "the Virgin Mary. It's not just an anchor, it's a conduit. They're channeling power through 400 years of accumulated faith and prayer." Elena grabbed his arm as understanding dawned. "But you touched it when the beam fell. You're connected to the same source." "More than connected," Miguel said, feeling the truth settle into his transformed consciousness like a key finding its lock. "I'm part of it now. The accident wasn't random. It was the activation point. The statue has been waiting my entire life for that moment of contact." The Watchers nodded in unison. "Now you begin to comprehend the true scope of your inheritance, Father. The healing, the blood tears, the whispers in ancient languages, all preparation for this confrontation. You carry within you the power to reclaim the conduit, but doing so will require you to fully accept what you have become." Miguel looked down at his hands, watching power flow beneath his skin like liquid starlight. The fear that had paralyzed him since awakening in the hospital was gone, replaced by cold certainty. He understood now that the choice had never been between remaining human or becoming a monster. It had been between accepting responsibility or fleeing from it. "I need a plan," he said, his voice carrying newfound authority. "Something more sophisticated than walking through the front door and hoping cosmic power trumps cosmic power." The eighth toll split the night, but this time it came from Miguel himself, his transformed voice harmonizing with forces that predated human civilization. The false ceremony within the church faltered as competing energies clashed in frequencies beyond normal perception. For the first time since this nightmare began, Miguel Santos smiled. "Let's save some children," he said. The plan crystallized in Miguel's transformed consciousness with mathematical precision. He would enter through the church's foundation, where decades of his own prayers had saturated the stones with protective energy. Elena would circle to the bell tower's external access, using her knowledge of the building's electrical systems to cut power at the precise moment he severed the statue's connection to the parasitic entities. The Watchers would position themselves at dimensional weak points around the perimeter, preventing the creatures from simply fleeing to regroup elsewhere. 30 seconds after the lights fail, the false Miguel will realize what's happening, his great-grandfather's voice explained through their shared consciousness. "You'll have perhaps 2 minutes before it abandons the ritual and turns its full attention to destroying you directly." Miguel nodded, power flowing through him in controlled pulses that made the storm clouds overhead rotate in impossible patterns. Each heartbeat now synchronized with cosmic forces that existed beyond human comprehension, yet somehow Elena's presence kept him anchored to the man he'd been. He realized with startling clarity that this was how the transformation was meant to work, not as an abandonment of humanity, but as its ultimate expression. "What about the children?" Elena asked, water streaming from her hair as she checked her watch. "If this thing wearing your face realizes it's losing control, it won't hurt them," Miguel said with absolute certainty. "Their terror is fuel for the dimensional breach. Dead, they're worthless. Traumatized and alive, they become permanent anchors for future invasions." He felt the truth of it resonating through inherited memories. His ancestors had faced similar scenarios across centuries, learning the entity's limitations through bitter experience. Elena's expression shifted as she processed the implications. "So, this never really ends. Even if we win tonight, they'll keep trying." "Yes," Miguel acknowledged, watching golden light begin to emanate from his skin as the moment of action approached. "But each failure weakens them, and each generation of guardians grows stronger. My great-grandfather faced 3 entities with nothing but holy water and determination. Tonight, I face dozens with power that could level city blocks." The Watchers began moving toward their positions, their forms flickering between dimensions as they prepared to seal the battlefield. Miguel felt their combined will focusing on the church like a lens concentrating starlight into laser intensity. 7 generations of accumulated purpose, all channeled toward this single confrontation. "Miguel," Elena said, her voice cutting through the supernatural harmonics building around them. "After this is over, assuming we survive, what happens to you?" He considered the question, examining his transformed state with newfound understanding. The power coursing through him carried a price, but not the one he'd feared. He wasn't becoming inhuman, he was becoming more human than any person should have to be. Every emotion intensified beyond normal limits, every moral choice carrying cosmic consequences, every moment of connection to others, weighted with the knowledge of what he'd sacrificed to protect them. "I remain Father Miguel Santos," he said finally. "But I also become something else. Guardian, protector, bridge between what humanity is and what it needs to survive in a universe full of hungry things that view our reality as food." Lightning split the sky directly overhead as Miguel began walking toward the church's foundation. Behind him, Elena ran toward the bell tower, her footsteps splashing through puddles that now reflected starlight from impossible angles. The watchers dispersed into positions that existed partially outside normal space, their combined presence creating a web of containment around the entire block. Through his enhanced awareness, Miguel felt the false ceremony faltering as his approach disrupted the energy pattern sustaining it. The children's terror was shifting to confusion as the entities struggled to maintain their human disguises against the interference of his transformed presence. Inside the sanctuary, his doppelganger raised its head from the ritual circle, cosmic intelligence burning behind stolen features. Miguel pressed his hands against the church's foundation stones, feeling 4 centuries of accumulated faith respond to his touch. The building itself began to sing, not audibly but in frequencies that resonated through dimensions beyond the physical. Every prayer spoken within these walls, every moment of genuine reverence, every instance of human connection to something greater than themselves, all of it flowing into him like a river of liquid starlight. "Now," he whispered, and Elena's training as an electrical engineer proved its worth as every light in the church died simultaneously. The false Miguel's scream of rage echoed across dimensional barriers as its carefully constructed ritual collapsed into chaos. Miguel felt the statue's connection to the parasitic entities severing like a cable under too much tension, power that had been flowing toward destruction suddenly reversing direction. He stepped through the church's stone wall as if it were made of water, emerging into the sanctuary transformed into something that could stand against cosmic horror while still choosing to love the humanity it protected. The final confrontation had begun. The sanctuary erupted into controlled chaos as Miguel materialized within consecrated space that had known his prayers for 15 years. The false Miguel spun from the ritual circle, its stolen features twisting with inhuman rage as dimensional energies collapsed around the children. 7 young faces turned toward him with expressions caught between terror and desperate hope. They recognized their priest, despite the golden radiance pouring from his transformed form. "Impossible," the doppelganger snarled, its voice layering multiple frequencies that made the ancient timbers groan. "The transformation should have consumed your consciousness entirely. You should be nothing but cosmic force wearing human memories." Miguel felt the truth of what he'd become settling into his bones like molten steel finding its final shape. The power flowing through him wasn't separate from his humanity. It was humanity weaponized, love transmuted into something capable of standing against entities that viewed compassion as exploitable weakness. Every moment of genuine faith he'd experienced, every prayer he'd offered for his lost brother, every instance of choosing hope over despair, all of it had been preparation for this confrontation. "You made one critical error," Miguel said, his voice harmonizing with frequencies that made the stained glass windows resonate like crystal bells. "You assumed the Santos bloodline produces monsters. We produce guardians." The children scrambled backward as the 2 versions of Father Miguel began circling each other across the sanctuary floor. Blood still marked geometric patterns around the altar, but the power they'd been designed to channel was fragmenting without the statue's anchoring presence. Through the broken windows, Miguel sensed, rather than saw, the parasitic entities fleeing back toward whatever dimensional crevices had spawned them. "The ritual is finished whether you stop me or not," the false Miguel taunted, raising hands that crackled with stolen cosmic energy. "The breach between realities will remain open. More of my kind will come. These children will feed our hunger eventually." But Miguel could feel the lie resonating like a discordant note against his enhanced perceptions. The entities were parasites, dependent on existing power sources rather than capable of generating their own. Without the statue's 4 centuries of accumulated faith to draw from, their foothold in this reality was already dissolving. The false Miguel was stalling, hoping to maintain its manifestation long enough to inflict maximum psychological damage before being forced back into whatever hell had spawned it. "Roberto," Miguel called to the youngest child without taking his eyes off the doppelganger. "Remember what we talked about during catechism? about how sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be afraid? 7-year-old Roberto Rodriguez nodded through tears, his small voice somehow audible despite the supernatural energies crackling through the air. Father Miguel says monsters only have the power we give them by being scared. The false Miguel's features began deteriorating as its connection to this dimension weakened further. What had been a perfect duplicate of Miguel's face started revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry and utterly alien. Compound eyes like fractured mirrors, teeth that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, appendages that violated geometric principles simply by existing. "You think you've won something here, Guardian?" It hissed through a mouth that no longer matched human anatomy. "Your ancestors thought the same thing. Century after century, they celebrated their temporary victories while we learned, we adapted, we grew stronger." Miguel stepped forward, power gathering around him like a visible storm front. This was the moment Elena's research had prepared him for. Not just the confrontation, but the choice that would define whether he remained Father Miguel Santos or became something else entirely. He could feel the cosmic force urging him toward overwhelming retaliation, toward unleashing enough energy to ensure this entity never threatened innocence again. Instead, he knelt beside little Roberto and offered his hand to the terrified boy. "I need you to help me remember something," Miguel said gently, his voice somehow maintaining human warmth despite the otherworldly harmonics. "Can you tell me why we pray for people who hurt us?" Roberto's small fingers closed around Miguel's transformed hand without hesitation. "Because forgiveness is stronger than hate. Because love wins even when it looks like it's losing." The words hit the false Miguel like physical blows, its deteriorating form writhing as simple human truth proved more devastating than any cosmic weapon. Around the sanctuary, the remaining children began joining hands, their innocent faith creating a web of protective energy that the parasitic entity couldn't penetrate. Miguel rose, still holding Roberto's hand, and faced his doppelganger with absolute clarity about who he was and what he chose to be. The transformation burning through his cells reached its culmination not in the abandonment of humanity, but in its perfect expression. Power without limit, guided by love without condition. "This is what you never understood," he said to the writhing horror that had worn his face. "The Santos bloodline doesn't guard against monsters. We guard against the fear that creates monsters." The false Miguel's scream shattered every remaining window as reality forcibly ejected its presence. Miguel felt the dimensional breach sealing itself, the church's foundation stones singing with restored harmony. 7 children looked up at their priest with wonder instead of terror, and Miguel Santos understood he had passed the final test. The sanctuary fell into profound silence as the echoes of the false Miguel's banishment faded, but Miguel's enhanced awareness detected something far more terrifying than the entity's final scream, a subtle vibration in the foundation stones that spoke of structural damage beyond repair. The steel beam that had crushed him weeks ago had been merely the first domino in a catastrophic sequence that was only now reaching its conclusion. "Everyone out," he commanded, his transformed voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "The building is going to collapse." But as the children scrambled toward the exits, Miguel felt reality itself convulse around them. The dimensional breach hadn't sealed completely. It was contracting like a wound, and the violent compression of cosmic forces was tearing holes in the fabric of local space-time. Through his enhanced perception, he watched cracks spreading through multiple layers of existence simultaneously, threatening to drag everything within a 3-block radius into whatever hellish void lay beyond. "Father Miguel," Roberto's voice cut through the chaos as ceiling beams began groaning overhead. The boy had stopped at the sanctuary doors, his 7-year-old face reflecting understanding far beyond his years. "The statue lady is crying again." Miguel spun toward the altar, where the ancient wooden Virgin Mary stood untouched despite the destruction surrounding her. Blood tears streamed down her carved features, But now he could see what the child's innocent perception had grasped immediately. The tears weren't flowing downward, they were rising, defying gravity, as they traced complex geometric patterns in the air above the statue's crowned head. The patterns matched the ritual circle the false Miguel had carved into the sanctuary floor, but inverted. Where the entity's symbols had been designed to tear reality apart, these blood-traced geometries were attempting to weave it back together. The statue wasn't just a conduit for cosmic power. It was a repair mechanism, activated by the same forces that had transformed him. "It's trying to fix the damage," he breathed, then louder. "Everyone stay back!" The children pressed against the sanctuary walls as Miguel approached the statue, feeling the cosmic force within him resonating with energies that predated human civilization. Through their shared consciousness, he sensed his ancestors' memories stirring, not just his great-grandfather, but generations stretching back to Spain, to the conquistadors who had first brought this carved figure to the New World carrying secrets they'd barely understood themselves. The Virgin Mary hadn't been carved by human hands. She was something far older, fashioned by the same cosmic intelligence that had shaped his bloodline across centuries. A tool left behind by entities so ancient that even the parasitic horrors he'd just banished were nothing more than scavengers feeding on their discarded refuse. "Miguel!" Elena's voice echoed from the bell tower through his enhanced hearing. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster. The entire electrical grid is fluctuating. I'm reading power surges that shouldn't be physically possible." The blood tears above the statue began spinning faster, their geometric patterns growing increasingly complex as they attempted to seal breaches in dimensional space that human science lacked words to describe. But Miguel could feel the strain of the process, threatening to tear the building apart at the molecular level. The statue needed an anchor, something to channel the repair energies through without destroying everything around it. Someone who had already been transformed by the same cosmic forces that had created it. "Roberto," Miguel called to the boy still watching from the doorway. "I need you to do something very important. When I touch the statue, you and the other children need to run outside as fast as you can. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "What about you, Father Miguel?" Miguel felt tears of his own, still human tears despite everything, sliding down his transformed features. The choice crystallizing before him wasn't between saving the children or saving himself. It was between accepting the final stage of his inheritance or allowing the dimensional damage to spread until it consumed not just San Esperanza, but potentially the entire Gulf Coast. The Santos bloodline had always produced guardians. Now he understood what that truly meant, not protectors who stood apart from those they defended, but bridges willing to span the gap between human and cosmic, regardless of the personal cost. "Tell Elena I kept my promise," he said, then placed both hands on the wooden statue's blood-streaked face. The contact sent him instantly beyond human perception, his consciousness merging with intelligence so vast that individual identity became meaningless. He felt himself dissolving into pure purpose as the repair energies channeled through his transformed cellular structure, using his body as a living conduit to weave reality back into stable configuration. Through fading human awareness, he heard the children's footsteps echoing toward safety and Elena's voice shouting his name from somewhere that seemed impossibly distant. The sanctuary around him began to phase between dimensions as cosmic forces rewrote the fundamental rules governing local space-time. Miguel Santos held onto one final thought as his consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual existence. Love had won, even when it looked like losing meant losing everything. The sanctuary dissolved around Miguel, as cosmic forces rewrote the fundamental architecture of reality itself. His consciousness, stretched beyond human limits, existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional layers, observing his physical form becoming translucent as repair energies channeled through every cell, while his awareness expanded to encompass the entirety of San Esperanza and the spreading cracks threatening to consume it. Through his transformed perception, He watched the children burst through the church doors into Elena's waiting arms, their small forms blazing like stars against his enhanced vision. Roberto turned back once, his 7-year-old face reflecting understanding that would haunt Miguel's dissolving humanity. The boy somehow grasped that his priest was choosing to become something else entirely so that others could remain safely human. The statue's blood tears accelerated their geometric dance, each droplet tracing equations that rewrote the laws governing local space-time. Miguel felt his consciousness being absorbed into the repair matrix. His individual identity, fragmenting as cosmic intelligence, used his transformed cellular structure as raw material for dimensional healing. The process was exquisitely painful, not physical agony, but the metaphysical anguish of watching everything that defined Miguel Santos burning away like newspaper in a forge. His memories of seminary training, of ordination day, of his brother Carlos laughing during their last conversation, all of it feeding into the cosmic fire that was sealing reality's wounds. The statue grew warm beneath his palms, its ancient wood softening as it absorbed his human experiences and transmuted them into something capable of bridging the gap between mortal understanding and cosmic necessity. Through fragmenting awareness, Miguel sensed Elena in the bell tower, her engineering expertise allowing her to track the electromagnetic signatures of dimensional repair in ways that would have driven most observers insane. She was calling his name through tears, knowing what his choice meant even as she watched power grids stabilizing across 3 parishes. Her grief became part of the equation, love's anguish transformed into another variable in reality's reconstruction. The Santos bloodline memories flooded through him as his individual consciousness dissolved. 7 generations of guardians who had faced this same choice, each accepting dissolution rather than allowing cosmic horror to devour the innocent. His great-grandfather's final moments, choosing to become a living seal rather than let parasitic entities establish permanent foothold in human reality. His great-great-grandmother, transforming herself into a protective ward that had shielded an entire village from interdimensional predators for 60 years. They hadn't died, they had become something else. Distributed consciousness woven into the fabric of protective barriers that still functioned across the Gulf Coast, invisible to human perception, but eternally vigilant against threats that existed beyond normal understanding. Now Miguel felt himself joining that network, his transformed essence spreading through dimensional space to reinforce weaknesses that other guardians had died protecting. But even as individual identities scattered like wind-blown ashes, something irreducibly human persisted at his core. The love he felt for his parishioners, for Elena, for the brother he'd lost, and the children he'd saved. These emotions proved too fundamental to erase, too essential to cosmic balance to be absorbed into pure function. The repair process began incorporating his humanity rather than consuming it, recognizing that love itself was a structural component of stable reality. Miguel's physical form became increasingly translucent as cosmic energy rewrote his molecular structure, but his consciousness suddenly snapped back into focus with crystalline clarity. He was dissolving, yes, but not disappearing, transforming into something that could exist simultaneously as Miguel Santos and as a living component of the defensive matrix, protecting human reality from cosmic predators. The statue's tears ceased their geometric dance as the dimensional wounds sealed completely, reality settling into new configurations that were stronger than before. Through his distributed awareness, Miguel felt the church's foundation stones singing with renewed stability, the building itself transformed into something that existed partially outside normal space-time, a sanctuary in the truest sense, protected by his willing sacrifice. Elena's voice reached him from impossible distances, her words somehow audible despite his consciousness now spanning multiple dimensional layers. "Miguel, can you hear me? Please tell me some part of you survived this." He tried to respond, to offer comfort to the woman who had stood beside him through transformation and terror. But speech required individual vocal cords and those were dissolving along with everything else that had once comprised Father Miguel Santos. Instead, he reached through the protective network his sacrifice had strengthened, gently touching her mind with the certainty that love truly did win, even when victory looked identical to loss. The children's laughter echoed across dimensional barriers as they discovered they were safe, their innocent joy becoming another element in the cosmic equation that now included Miguel's distributed essence. Roberto's voice carried particular clarity. Father Miguel kept his promise. He said love always wins. Through the network of protective consciousness that was his new existence, Miguel Santos felt profound peace settling over San Esperanza. The cost of victory had been everything he'd thought defined him as an individual human being. The reward was becoming something infinitely greater, guardian, protector, and eternal bridge between humanity's fragile beauty and the vast indifference of cosmic forces that would devour it without love's willing sacrifice standing watch. The morning sun streamed through windows that should have been shattered, illuminating a sanctuary that defied every law of physics Elena understood. She stood in the doorway where 7 children had fled the night before, her engineering mind struggling to process what her instruments confirmed. The church existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously ancient and newly born, existing in normal space while extending into dimensions that had no names. "The electromagnetic readings are impossible," she whispered to Dr. Sarah Chen, who had arrived from LSU with a team of physicists before dawn. "The building is generating a protective field that extends exactly 3 blocks in every direction. Nothing that happened here should have left anything standing." Dr. Chen consulted her tablet, her face pale with the implications of the data. The energy signatures suggest reality was fundamentally rewritten at the quantum level. But Elena, according to these readings, the field isn't powered by any external source. It's being sustained by something that registers as both matter and consciousness simultaneously. Elena's throat tightened as she approached the altar where Miguel had made his final choice. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood exactly as it had for 4 centuries, its wooden features serene, but the air around it shimmered with barely visible energy patterns. The blood tears had dried, leaving faint geometric traces on the carved cheeks that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Miguel?" she called softly, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "I know you're here somehow. The children keep insisting they can still hear your voice." Roberto Rodriguez sat in the front pew with his grandmother, drawing pictures with crayons, while other families filtered in to see the sanctuary that had become impossible. His 7-year-old artwork showed stick figures holding hands around a church that glowed like a star, with a smiling face in the sky above them. "Father Miguel isn't gone," Roberto announced with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "He's just bigger now. He told me he can protect everyone this way." His grandmother crossed herself, her weathered hands trembling as she touched the pew that had been splintered by supernatural forces only hours earlier. The wood was whole again, but it hummed with energy that raised the hair on her arms. "The boy speaks truth. I can feel Miguel's presence in every stone, every beam. He became part of the church itself." Elena sank into a pew, overwhelmed by grief and wonder in equal measure. Her scientific training demanded skepticism, but her instruments confirmed what her heart already knew. Miguel's consciousness hadn't been destroyed. It had been distributed, woven into the protective matrix that now shielded San Esperanza from threats that existed beyond human perception. He was everywhere and nowhere, present but untouchable, transformed into something that could love humanity while transcending its limitations. Father Antonio Vasquez arrived from the diocesan headquarters, his official demeanor cracking as he witnessed the sanctuary's impossible state of preservation. "The bishop sent me to assess the damage and arrange for emergency services. But Elena, how do I write a report about this? How do I explain that Father Santos appears to have become a living miracle?" "You don't," Elena replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "You tell them the church was damaged in the storm but has been stabilized. Some truths are too large for institutional forms." The pilgrims began arriving by noon. Families who had heard whispered stories about the priest who had defeated demons and saved children, who had chosen transformation over self-preservation. They came seeking healing, seeking answers, seeking connection to something greater than their daily struggles, and somehow, impossibly, they found it. Mrs. Catherine Boudreau, whose arthritis had crippled her hands for 20 years, touched the pew where Miguel had knelt and felt her fingers moving freely for the first time in decades. James Morrison, battling stage 4 cancer, experienced complete remission after spending an hour in prayer before the statue. The healings weren't dramatic or ostentatious. They were gentle, natural, as if the sanctuary's transformed reality simply didn't permit unnecessary suffering within its boundaries. Elena watched the quiet miracles unfold while monitoring her instruments obsessively, documenting phenomena that would revolutionize physics if anyone believed her data. But the numbers mattered less than the peace she felt settling over her grief. Miguel had found the answer to his crisis of faith not in theological arguments, but in absolute surrender to love's demands. As evening approached, she found herself alone in the sanctuary as the last pilgrims departed. The sunset light streaming through the windows created patterns that reminded her of Miguel's final transformation. Beautiful, impossible, eternally protective. "I understand now," she said to the presence that permeated every molecule of the sacred space. "You didn't lose yourself, you found yourself. You became exactly what you were always meant to be." The air around the statue shimmered briefly, and Elena could swear she felt familiar arms embracing her with comfort that transcended physical touch. Love had indeed won, even though victory had required redefining what winning meant. San Esperanza slept peacefully that night, protected by a guardian who had chosen to become love itself. The weeks that followed transformed San Esperanza into something neither tourist destination nor religious shrine, but a living testament to transformation's quiet power. Elena found herself returning each morning to the sanctuary, no longer as the skeptical engineer who had first documented Miguel's healings, but as someone who had witnessed love's ultimate victory and needed to understand what came next. 3 weeks after Miguel's transformation, she stood before the statue with a letter from the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints. The official envelope trembled in her hands as she read Cardinal Toretti's formal request for testimony regarding alleged miraculous phenomena associated with Father Miguel Santos. The Church wanted to investigate, to categorize, to determine whether Miguel's sacrifice qualified for the careful bureaucracy of beatification. "They want to make you a saint," she said to the shimmering presence that permeated every stone, "as if you were dead, instead of more alive than any of us." The response came not as words but as warmth flooding through her consciousness, amusement mixed with infinite tenderness. Miguel's transformed awareness touched her mind with the gentle certainty that institutional recognition mattered far less than the children who played safely in San Esperanza's streets, protected by love that had chosen permanence over individual survival. Roberto Rodriguez burst through the sanctuary doors, now 8 years old and carrying a construction worker's hard hat that dwarfed his small head. Behind him walked Elena's brother Carlos, not Miguel's Carlos, who remained beyond death's veil, but her own brother who had driven from Houston after months of estrangement over their father's funeral arrangements. "Elena?" Carlos's voice carried the hesitation of someone who had rehearsed apologies during the 3-hour drive. "I got your letter. You said I needed to see something that would help me understand grief differently." She had written to him in desperation, knowing that Miguel's transformation had taught her something essential about losing people you loved, that love itself never died, only changed form. Carlos had been drowning in anger since their father's heart attack, raging against medical systems and divine justice with the fury of someone who believed death meant absolute ending. "Sit with me," Elena said, gesturing to the front pew where Roberto had claimed his grandmother could hear angels singing. "And try to keep your engineering skepticism quiet for 10 minutes. Carlos settled beside her, his contractor's hands fidgeting with the hard hat's chin strap. "Elena, I came because you sounded different in that letter. Not broken anymore. I need to know how you found peace, because I'm drowning without it." The sanctuary filled with presence that registered differently to each person who encountered it. Elena felt Miguel's consciousness as protective warmth. Roberto experienced playful encouragement that made him giggle during serious prayers. Carlos, still raw with fresh grief, felt something else entirely, understanding that transcended judgment, acceptance that embraced even his rage against God's apparent cruelty. "Jesus," Carlos whispered as tears started flowing. "There's someone here. I can feel him listening, and he's not telling me I'm wrong to be angry. He's just staying with me while I hurt." Elena reached for her brother's hand, feeling Miguel's transformed love flowing through her own capacity for comfort. His name was Miguel Santos. He lost his brother in a construction accident and spent months questioning everything he believed about divine justice. Then he chose to become the answer instead of demanding one. Through the afternoon, she told Carlos about Miguel's crisis of faith, about supernatural battles and impossible choices, about love that proved stronger than individual survival. But mostly she spoke about transformation, how grief could become something other than endless loss if you stopped fighting its power to change you. Roberto climbed into Carlos's lap with the unconscious trust that children showed toward adults who carried familiar pain. "Father Miguel says your daddy is still with you, just in a way that's too big for your eyes to see. Like how he's still with us, but bigger than just one person now." Carlos's skepticism crumbled as he held the boy who somehow knew exactly what he needed to hear. The hard hat slipped forgotten to the floor as his engineer's mind encountered phenomena that demanded expansion beyond materialist certainty. Miguel's presence didn't offer explanations that satisfied rational inquiry. It provided comfort that transcended the need for explanations. As evening approached, Elena found herself flanked by two people who had entered the sanctuary, broken, and were leaving transformed. Carlos would return to Houston with grief that remained real but no longer felt like drowning. Roberto would continue growing up protected by love that had chosen to become eternal vigilance. "I'm different now," Elena said as they prepared to leave. "I came here fighting to save Miguel from his crisis of faith. Instead, he saved me from believing that love ends when people do." The sanctuary filled with shimmering presence, one final time, as sunset light painted the windows with colors that suggested infinite possibility. Miguel Santos had indeed returned, not to his old life, but to a new form of existence that encompassed everyone he had ever loved and would ever love. San Esperanza slept peacefully again, watched over by a guardian who had discovered that becoming love itself was the only victory that truly lasted, the new beginning. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood in the rebuilt rectory office, sorting through boxes of Miguel's personal belongings that the diocese had finally released to her care. The morning light streaming through the windows carried the same golden quality she'd first noticed during Miguel's healing sessions, as if the sanctuary's transformation had permanently altered the way sunlight behaved in San Esperanza. She lifted Miguel's worn Bible from the box, its pages marked with decades of handwritten notes in the margins. The book fell open to Corinthians, "Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away." Miguel had underlined those words so many times the ink had worn through the paper. "Father Miguel says you can keep his books." Elena turned to find Roberto Rodriguez in the doorway, now 8.5, and appointed by some invisible authority as the sanctuary's unofficial interpreter of Miguel's continued presence. The boy had grown 3 inches since that September night, but his eyes still held the wisdom of someone who conversed daily with transformed love. "He's here now?" Elena asked, no longer questioning the impossibility of such conversations. Roberto nodded solemnly. "He's always here, but right now he's paying attention instead of just watching. He wants me to tell you something important." Elena set the Bible aside and knelt to Roberto's eye level. Over the months, she'd learned to trust the boys' communications with their transformed guardian. Miguel spoke through Roberto with the same gentle humor and profound compassion he'd shown in life, just distributed across dimensional space that permitted presence without physical form. "He says the new priest is good but scared," Roberto reported with 8-year-old directness. "Father Luis thinks he has to be like Father Miguel was, but Father Miguel says that's impossible. Everyone has to be their own kind of love." Through the window, Elena watched Father Luis Moreno working in the church garden, carefully tending roses that bloomed with supernatural vigor. The young priest had arrived from the seminary 3 weeks ago, hand-picked by Bishop Toretti to shepherd a parish that had become legendary throughout the Catholic world. Daily pilgrims came seeking healing, blessing, and connection to the divine presence that permeated every stone of Our Lady of Sorrows. But Father Luis struggled beneath the weight of expectations that compared every homily, every blessing, every pastoral decision to Miguel's transformed legacy. Elena had watched him pray before the statue each morning, pleading for guidance from a predecessor who had transcended normal definitions of mentorship. "Tell Father Miguel I'll speak with Luis," Elena said. "Some burdens are easier to carry when someone else understands the weight." Roberto's face brightened with relief. "Father Miguel says that's exactly what he hoped you'd say. He picked you to help the new people because you understand how love changes but never leaves." The truth of that statement had become Elena's new normal. She'd taken extended leave from her engineering firm to serve as unofficial liaison between the sanctuary's miraculous reality and visitors who arrived seeking healing they couldn't find elsewhere. Scientists came to study impossible phenomena. Theologians came to witness divine presence in quantum form. Broken people came hoping transformation might touch their own desperate circumstances. All of them left changed, though rarely in ways they'd expected. That afternoon, Elena found Father Luis kneeling before the altar, where Miguel had made his ultimate choice. The young priest's shoulders shook with quiet tears as he struggled through prayers that felt inadequate beside the sanctuary's overwhelming holiness. "Father Santos didn't start with this level of faith," Elena said gently, settling into the pew behind him. "When I first met him, he was questioning everything he'd ever believed about God's justice. The miracles came later, after he'd worked through his own crisis." Luis turned toward her with grateful desperation. "Everyone expects me to perform miracles, to speak with the same authority Father Santos possessed. But I feel his presence constantly, and it makes my own faith seem so small." "Miguel would tell you that faith isn't measured by size," Elena replied, feeling the familiar warmth that indicated their guardian's focused attention. "He'd remind you that love grows by being shared, not by being perfect." As if responding to her words, the air around the statue shimmered with gentle energy. Luis gasped as he felt Miguel's transformed consciousness offering not comparison or judgment, but welcome, one priest embracing another across the boundary between individual existence and distributed love. Through Roberto's continued interpretations over the following days, Miguel helped Father Luis understand that serving a transformed sanctuary didn't require duplicating someone else's journey. Each person's path to love would be unique, shaped by their own struggles and gifts and willingness to surrender personal limitations for something greater. The diocese eventually stopped pressuring Elena for official reports about the sanctuary's impossible physics. Cardinal Toretti visited once, spent 3 hours in prayer before the statue, and returned to Rome with the recommendation that some mysteries served God better by remaining officially unexamined. San Esperanza settled into its new rhythm. Ordinary coastal town blessed with extraordinary protection, watched over by love that had chosen permanence over individual survival. Children played in streets guarded by supernatural vigilance. Families found healing that transcended medical explanation. Pilgrims discovered that transformation remained possible even in a world that seemed determined to crush hope. And Elena Martinez continued her work as bridge between Miguel's transformed existence and those still learning that love's ultimate victory sometimes looked identical to death, until you understood that love had never been limited to individual human hearts in the first place. On quiet evenings, she would sit in the sanctuary reading Miguel's books, while Roberto colored pictures of stick figures, holding hands around a church that glowed like a star. The peace that had replaced her grief wasn't the absence of loss, but the presence of love that had become too large for any single person to contain. Miguel Santos had found his answer to the crisis of faith, not in theological arguments or miraculous healings, but in the willing choice to become love itself, eternally present wherever protection was needed, forever watching over those who still carried their individual hearts through a world that required both courage and tenderness to survive. The sanctuary bells rang peacefully at sunset, calling San Esperanza to evening prayers guided by a priest who lived in transformed flesh and another who existed as living sanctuary, together teaching their people that love never truly ended. It only found new ways to say yes to life.